So good to see you all again. Unfortunately, Monica wasn't able to join us because you both are quite busy, right, Monica?
Yeah, we have a lot going on. But we were really excited that, we were able to make time for the event on Monday night and continue the conversation.
I was wondering if everybody could just briefly introduce themselves and say what they're up to in terms of this bridging the divide that we've been working on.
I can start. I'm Bo. I'm with Between Americans, which is an online conversation that's happening over the course of a year among a dozen Hillary voters and a dozen Trump voters.
I think I talked over you. Her name is Bo.
And my name is Annika Anand. I'm a co-founder of TheEvergrey, which is a news organization in Seattle that we launched a few months ago, out to help Seattleites feel more connected to the city, connected to each other. And my co-founder, Monica Guzman, and I, after the election, got together a group of Seattleites to go down to Sherman County, Oregon, which was the closest county that voted completely opposite of King County, which is where Seattle's located. So, most of the people we took down to Oregon had all voted for Hillary, and everyone we spoke with, most people I should say, that we spoke with in Sherman County had actually voted for Trump. And so the goal was to just facilitate a conversation between those folks for an afternoon.
Wow. Oh, and we should mention Annika's in a Seattle coffee shop, so that's what's going on behind her.
Sorry if it's a little loud. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah,
totally fine.
You're fine.
Lots of local character, though.
There you go. This is Seattle.
And Heidi, do you want to tell people about yourself and us?
Yeah, so I'm Heidi Ptech, and I live in the Nashville area, and Kelly and I have started a project called the HeartPerceptionProject, and it's birthed out of really our desire to keep our friendship alive, despite the fact that I voted for Trump and she voted for Hillary. We've been friends since junior high, so we have a 30-year friendship going, and it's been quite a journey for the two of us to learn how to communicate in healthy ways with each other, and then to teach others to do the same.
Right. And I will add that the 30 years has not been without actually long periods of non-contact or limited contact because of not knowing how to navigate the ideological divide between us. But after the last election, we began a concerted effort to figure out how to do that and still be true to our own selves and our own beliefs. And as a result of that, we've been teaching workshops and exploring with others about how to do that as well. So Monday night, we had such a fun time on a Seattle Town Hall panel, and I'm so curious to hear your takeaways on that. What were some of the highlights and what were some of the surprising things? I'm curious, or anything you want to share about.
Well, for me, I was quite nervous walking into that because I knew that I was the only conservative on the panel, and probably, I don't know, there may have been a few other conservatives in the room, but with a crowd of 150, I thought, oh, this could be really bad for me. But surprisingly, people were very respectful with their questions and their comments, and you guys were so welcoming and kind to me, and I felt very much at home, like we could have sat and had conversations for hours. So I was surprised in a good way.
Heidi, I'm curious, did you at all feel like you were in some way representing the Trump voter demographic?
Yes, I really did. I really did. And that felt like a great deal of responsibility for me because I knew this was going to be taped. And then I knew, oh my, I mean, I've got people here in town and then a lot of other folks too that I knew were going to watch it. And if I'm the voice, oh my goodness, what a responsibility.
But I think in a way also it's kind of an unfair responsibility, right? And this actually gets to the question that we got from a person in the audience about identity politics. I mean, I think having, I mean, I hope maybe this was clear in the event. I don't know if any of us actually explicitly said this, but like, I hope that one of the takeaways from the event was that we can't paint these broad strokes of who people are based on who they support or who they vote for. Actually, that we all have our own individual issues and experiences that we bring to the decisions we make. So I think it's actually an unfair responsibility, to have everybody look at you as, this is what every Trump voter in America thinks. And I hope that people, didn't necessarily think that by the end of the event.
Yes. Because the idea is to help people see that the polarization happens so much because of the rhetoric in the media and the rhetoric of the politicians. But in real life, there's so many nuances that make up our decisions and who we are as people. And it's those nuances that help us to find connections despite that polarization.
Well, and it's interesting, Annika, to draw that parallel between polarization and this concept of identity politics, because both do involve this attempt to simplify our understanding of the world by putting people into categories and figuring out how to deal with each category separately.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was actually something Monica and I talked about after the event, was we wish that we had had a better answer on the identity politics question. I think it probably took, I don't know how you guys heard that. And Heidi, were you there for that question still, or had you left? Okay, so somebody came up and said, how does identity politics basically fit into everything that you're talking about? And I remember Monica looking at me and being like, "Hey, do you want to take this one?" And I shook my head at her.
Oh, that's so funny. I saw that interaction and I took that as we don't know how to answer that question. So that's why I went that route of what actually do you mean by that question? Because
no, and I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, that was a really good clarification.
That was a good follow-up. But anyway, so Monica and I talked after the event, and we didn't feel like we totally satisfactorily answered that question. But I think part of that is just because I don't know. I did open up a little bit about, the race question and being a person of color and what that means. But God, that's a whole nother panel discussion, man. We
can't talk about that and dialogue at the same time.
Too much.
Whole category. Well, and the thing is, I was thinking about it after, and you guys saw my Facebook post about this idea that when you communicate, you're compressing what's actually in your brain into these tiny, this limited vocabulary, and then sending it across space and bringing it into somebody else's brain. And the fact that we've gotten down to this very text-based message of communication is that everything's shortened, right? So even the term identity politics, we're like, what exactly do you mean by that? Because that's this compression of an idea that has come to expand into a totally different idea in each person's head. And I feel like I was thinking a little bit afterward too about some of the stuff that that fellow was talking about in terms of, he looked like an East Asian American man talking about trying to figure out where he has privilege and where he doesn't. And this is all shorthand, right? This kind of, these rules that we've created around the tiers of privilege. And there's no way to unwrap that without just these one-on-one conversations that de-aggregate people back into separate human beings.
Yeah. Kelly and I did discover, in fact, we've talked about this quite a bit, that the ability to ask a curious question, to ask another person to define what they mean by a particular term is so important, because we may think we're talking about the same thing and we could be talking about something completely different. And a term that we might use might completely offend somebody else, and we don't know. We don't know why. But if they say, "Hey, can you tell me what you mean by that?" then you can explain it. And then they go, "Oh, okay, I get it now. Oh, right. So you didn't mean that in a way that I'll take as an offense. You meant it as, oh, that's how you're thinking of it."
There's actually a project that I worked on when I was at the Seattle Times last year called Under Our Skin. And the whole concept behind it was asking people to define the words they use when they talk about race. So defining the word microaggression, racist, racism, person of color even. it's really, really fascinating. I encourage you guys to check it out because I think
really cool.
so much ties into what we're trying to do with conversation building across, ideologies and really looking at the words we use to do that. And so I think that's a great point. We found that people, from lots of different backgrounds with lots of different experiences define the words differently, even though you might assume that, because these two people are, Latina or Black, they would define it exactly the same way, which just wasn't true.
Yeah.
So another good example.
Right.
Yeah.
What did you all think about, I was just really struck by how many of the questions were restating the issue of, did we change anyone? And it came across in different subtle ways. I mean, it seemed like over and over people were trying to understand the point of what we are working on, and if we're not changing people, assuming that our motivation is to change people, and if we're not changing people, what's the use? And it was really fascinating to me, and I was curious how that came across to you two. I know by that point you were gone, Heidi, but it really was a prevalent question.
The woman asked the question, I understand about the kumbaya, like we all want kumbaya, but how much does it really affect people at the polls? They're going to vote the same way. And are we really going to help change any policies by this civil dialogue? So I did get that question.
Okay.
I remember thinking afterward that part of maybe, like, it's such a big mental shift to get from this debate-oriented mentality into a more dialogue-oriented mentality, right? And debate-oriented mentality is all about that. Like, what's the result? It's about certainty, right? What's the answer?
Mm-hmm.
And part of what happens with dialogue is, I mean, there are these subtle changes that can happen, right? Like people stop looking for easy answers because, I mean, I think we might say that on both sides, there has been a sort of a trend toward kind of like more demagogish answers, like, I know exactly how to fix our country. It's 1, 2, and 3. And that comes from a lack of understanding, I think, on the level of the population of just how complex our demography is, how complex the makeup of our country is. Mm-hmm. So even if we don't end up coming up with any answers, but at least we're kind of demagogue proofing our population through better understanding of each other, that's this subtle shift that we'll never notice, right? Like I feel like a lot of these changes that would happen through dialogue, you would never notice because it's a cultural, slow shift from just one spot, point A to point B.
Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting. When we were doing our event in the downstairs part of Town Hall Seattle, there was another discussion going on upstairs, and it was called the Rise of the Right Across Western Democracies. And it was a bunch of political scientists, talking about that topic. And the next day, we got an email from one of our readers, our Evergrey readers, who was at that event. And said, it's kind of ironic that you had these guys up there, basically what they were saying was, the quote that our reader said was, at one point, the moderator, who's I think a political scientist, professor at the UW, said, what to do about that 20 to 25% of people who voted for Trump. Write them off. They are never coming back. Never. It will not happen. And so I think it's interesting that conversation was happening upstairs, and the conversation we were having was much different. But basically this reader said, I love you guys. I love the Evergrey, but I really think you're wrong on this. And I think that, actually, he was just like, I think political change, the way political change is going to happen is by, not by having these kinds of conversations that we're advocating for. And so Monica and him actually went back and forth over email. And what was interesting was at one point, Monica asked, well, what are your goals, right? If the goal is political change, maybe that's one thing. But if the goal is to live in a world where, you know, we can have civil conversations with each other and just get along as human beings, maybe that's just another thing. And so I think that question came up a lot because maybe just people have different goals without sort of explicitly saying so, if that makes sense.
Oh, I love that, because I'm having this thought is that we are confusing our strategies for a goal. And if we look at the strategies, I mean, if you take it to the farthest reach, I mean, people who want political change want to live in a world that feels safer and more supportive of their belief system, right? So they use political change to affect that. But the goal is peace. And, you know, it seems like the goals are actually the broad-based themes that we all want, right? But we're so focused on the strategies that we lose touch with the idea that there may be different strategies to get there. And I mean, both Heidi and I kept talking about how, well, if one of your goals is safety, if one of your goals is love, if one of your goals is community, that you can experience that through connection, even with people you disagree with. So it's so fascinating to me.
Well, I don't know if you remember the one lady who walked up and said, I think it was actually that same lady who said the whole kumbaya thing, but she made the comment, what is the tipping point of convincing somebody that to agree with you? Sorry, it got really loud in here.
That's
Somebody's
all right,
making a very loud chai. So she asked, what is that tipping point of getting somebody to agree with you? And like, basically, how do I make that happen, right? Like, how do I make everybody agree with me? And I think, like, I remember in the moment I said something like, oh yeah, you know, everybody should just think the way we do, right? Like, it's like, it's such a strange concept to me that would be the goal, to make everybody think like you do.
Yeah.
But maybe it's always been that way. I don't know.
I think, you know, that actually just made me think about an exchange I had with a friend of mine who commented about, like, you know, he's kind of like, you know, again, similar idea, you know, if people are just xenophobic, then do we need to change your psychology? Do we need to change media communication? Do we need to change? And my feeling, this is just, I think, my orientation is that we're all psychology. And like, sometimes we'll backfill justification for how we got to the conclusion that we got to. But for the most part, it's, you get to the conclusion that you want to get to, you live in the reality that you want to live in, and then you have an explanation for it, right? And so what I said was, I think that sometimes on the left, we, because we tend to be more aligned with the quote unquote experts, like, you know, the institutions, mainstream media, the like universities, that sort of a thing, that that's also part of our psychology, is that we are somewhat committed to being aligned with the experts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the right kind of approach spiritually for our country, in kind of the same way that somebody's definition of success might not jive with how you're meant to live your life.
Right.
Mm-hmm. There was, that brings to mind, so I was contacted by The Stranger yesterday. They want to make me their person of interest, you know, in an upcoming issue. And so they sent me these questions, and one of them was like, so you're working with a Trump supporter on this, who's also an evangelical Christian. How do you connect with someone who believes the world was built in 6 days? And I was like, I love this question so much, because it just drives right at the heart of what we liberals like will do, right? We will pick out a weird quirk that, you know, that we look at in a belief system or in a system of thought, and we focus on that as an example of why we can't get along with someone, or why we shouldn't even bother.
Right.
And yet, like, that is just a portion of what what Heidi is. Like, it's just like, and I'm sure Heidi's team could come up with all sorts of weird quirks about who I am and what I believe, and use that as a similar, like, well, how could you get along with someone who, thinks it's okay to abort fetuses, or, whatever. So
did you turn it around and say, can you rephrase that as a curious question?
It wasn't a back and
sounds
forth.
a little loaded.
I would love to hear the stranger's rephrasal as a curious question.
Oh my gosh, and the whole process of like answering these questions, I was just like, oh, here's another thing that I'm just so curious about. Like, I tried to answer them as authentically and as like from my heart as possible. And I was like, this is so not gonna fly with the stranger readership, because it's not in my head. It's not, backed up by acceptable current narrative in our circles. And then it was just interesting to like witness the fear too of like, oh, if I say it wrong, if I do it wrong, I'm gonna be taken out in the woodshed, and I talked about this in one of the answers. It was like, what do you feel like people in Seattle complain too much about? And I was like, well, I think this is more of a human thing than just a Seattle thing, but it's like, we're policing each other all the time, on both sides. And it's created this culture in which we don't allow people to make mistakes, and then consequently we don't allow ourselves to make mistakes. And because it's just so hard to deal with all of our collective anger that we're aiming everywhere, and intolerance, or so.
It kind of reminded me a little bit of, sometimes I think about that push to prosecute and convict when a crime has been committed, even if there's not that much evidence against the perpetrator who's been convicted of the crime. Just this idea that you just want justice. You see an injustice and you want to move to a feeling that justice has been served. And sometimes if you can't really find who that perpetrator is, the anger just kind of flows around.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
On a related note to that, I mean, I think after the election, Monica and I are really trying to figure out, what is our, not stance, but like, how are we going to respond to, the city's collective grief right now? Because really, after the election, it felt like there was this dark cloud over Seattle for weeks, I think. And I think I shared this with you guys, but I was very much under that cloud. Like my husband came home from work one day and I was just like crying on the couch. Like I just didn't know what to do. And I'm not somebody that gets particularly emotional about politics, or, in general, but it felt draining. It felt like a really hard time. And so Monica had I had a lot of conversations about what to do next. And we decided, we should focus. I took a little bit of convincing. Monica was like really the leader on this, which I will be forever grateful for. But, we really wanted to focus on the importance of having these conversations, talking with people who disagree with us, who may not share, our same views that we do. And that felt like a really, really, not just controversial, but hard view to take in Seattle. Like at the same time, the stranger had created a resist tag, like a resist Trump tag that they were putting on all of their content that they were writing about. That was all about like resisting the administration, which is fine. That's great. Like that. I mean, that maybe that is like just part of the fight that needs to be fought for sure. Other publications, I felt like were kind of doing similar things and saying, now is the time for journalists to stand up. And, and I was kind of like, well, it's always been the time for journalists to stand up. It should always be journalists versus the government, like not, but anyway. So it's interesting because for me over time, it hasn't just been about, having conversations with conservatives because I'm a liberal. It's also been about having conversations with liberals because I found myself in between the two in a lot of ways, right? And so I think that's been something that's been kind of, frankly, like isolating about being somebody who is really advocating for these conversations right now, is that it doesn't feel at least like there's a lot of us, which is why I've been so obsessive about this resources page that we've been keeping, because it's like, there are more of us. Yeah, my whole point just being that, it can go both ways. It's not just about me as a liberal trying to communicate with other conservatives. It actually feels like me as a person who values these conversations talking to people who don't. And that sort of feels like the tension that I'm at right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which feels like it goes to that, we've all seen that documentary now, right? The Accidental Courtesy, and that scene between the Black Lives Matter activists and Daryl Davis, two different movements working towards the same thing. And it was so interesting to see how they were clashing among themselves because they were both thinking that their approach was the right one when we need multiple approaches. Yeah.
Well, and I've had conservatives that have just been like, and you think this is gonna do what? And good luck to you. I hope it goes well, but I am not interested in having those kind of conversations with liberals that are all really mad right now. They're all gonna take it out on you. But it was neat. I just came from a lunch with some friends, and Lindsay was one of the friends that came with me this weekend, and it's her birthday today. And we were sitting at lunch and talking about our weekend, and I knew there were a couple of women at the table who don't share the same views that we do and hold to a little more liberal view. And she, the one particular woman, as I was leaving, she said, "Hey, Heidi, what would you think about us getting locals together here to have the kind of conversations that you had in Seattle? You realize you don't have to go all the way to the other side of the United States to find liberal people. They're right here in Nashville." And I was like, oh, I would love that. That would be great. I totally welcome that. So we're going to do it and get a bunch of women together from all different sides with all different views and have the same kinds of conversations. So I'm looking forward to it. And I'm glad that Kelly and I have started doing this, traveling to each other's areas, but I know it needs to happen where I live too. I need to be doing this on my own here without my compadre.
Yeah, and we're hoping we can do more of this in Seattle as well. We traveled out to Sherman County, Oregon, because the original thing was that we had used this app that the Washington Post had built where you could put in your zip code and actually see the nearest geography that voted exactly opposite of you. But there are plenty of conservatives in Seattle somewhere. I don't know. I need to find them. But
I can help you with that. We've got a few.
There we go. So yeah, I mean, that's something that we want to continue doing here as well at home.
Is that your next step for what you are doing?
It's tough because we really are, it's just me and Monica running this thing right now. And we're doing so much in addition to these conversations. We put out a daily email newsletter. We're doing other events. We're working with clients because we need a business model, because we need to make money. So we have a lot going on, but what I'm really excited about is to find other people in the area who want to partner on events like this. And that's been a really, looking at you. That's been a really exciting part about getting more visibility around the Sherman County project, is finding so many other people who want to do similar things here that we can collaborate with.
Yeah, and then finding people in other cities too, who, there are people hosting dinners, and we've heard about so many other organizations, and to have kind of a network of folks people that we know in other cities, we can point them toward those resources.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, it'd be great to get more calls like this with other people who are doing similar things. You've got such a long list.
Yeah. check it out,
See more of
TheEvergrey.com.
Yeah, and Bo, give your information on your company as well, how people can find you.
Yeah, sure. Just go to BetweenAmericans.org. There's a mailing list you can sign up for, and there's a way to get in touch with me on that website as well.
That's great.
And we are HeartPerceptionProject.com is the way you can find us. And it'll take you to a blog that basically has the written correspondence and observations between Heidi and I since we first started interacting the day after the election, or intentionally interacting. So,
Right.
mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Guys. Always fun. I hope we can continue to do this.
Yes. Let's stay in touch.
For sure. All right. Bye, guys.